But for example, I was talking last week with a company, they're active in the fastener industry. And for them, the difference is, do I add 70 euros per every ton that I'm importing? And the average price per ton over there was like 900 euros. Or do I add 700 euros if I have to go for defect values?
Ouch. Oh.
So it's massive.
Oh, yeah. Doubling the price, that's heavy.
Hello, welcome back to the Gold Casting podcast. And today we are still in the theme about alloys, which we find extremely interesting. And one thing is the topic of CBAM. Now, this is quite a big subject. We all heard about it. Many people are concerned and understanding it is not super easy. So we brought ourselves an expert, Mr. Marcel Duits. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, pleasure is ours. Now, we know you, Marcel, but quite many, I guess, of our audience does not. So could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Dutch. My name is Marcel Duits. I'm living my life currently in the Czech Republic. I'm the owner of Dubrink, co-owner, I have to say. We are a CBAM platform with over 2,000 companies connected to our platform where we automate CBAM and provide advisory. I do that with a wonderful team from the lovely city in Prague. And next to that, I'm also president of the International Association for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where we mainly focus on sharing knowledge as well certification by setting standards to make sure companies are not, let's say, make mistakes in CBAM, because knowing what CBAM is and how to work with it is one, but avoiding mistakes, that's maybe the most important topic for the upcoming year.
So you're like the insurance.
I can't call it insurance, because if you have standards and you certify companies on that, you can't guarantee that they don't make mistakes. But especially half a year ago, we saw so many things going wrong. Just understanding how to calculate emissions, or just making sure that you, within a company, you have a procurement manager who understands CBAM, but also the CFO, because in some companies it has a massive impact on the profitability. These basics are very important to have aligned, and that's what we do over there.
Absolutely, and I think we have to really get deep into that topic. As in the foundry industry, it is quite common that castings are purchased worldwide from the cheapest supplier and then imported into the EU. So I think let's start with the basics. Can you give us an introduction to CBAM, what it is and what it's about?
Yeah, CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's a mechanism what is already happening since 2023 Q4, but it became a hot topic in 2026, because from that moment, companies don't only have to report their emissions, but if you import certain goods, and then we talk about steel, iron, aluminium, cement, hydrogen, electricity, and fertilizers, and within there certain CN codes, you have to pay over those emissions that you're importing. And you do that by paying in 2027 for certain certificates. And the reason why we do that is because in the EU, we have the ETS system. We want to produce clean. That means that we want to limit the CO2 we emit. And the EU doesn't find it fair that if all the factories in the EU have to comply to high standards and make costs for decarbonization and producing cleaner, that if you are, for example, producing in, let's say, China or in India, that you could technically heat up your factory with tires, have much less costs, and eventually sell that for a significant lower price in the EU. And the EU says, look, you can produce how you want. It's not us who is going to dictate that. However, once you import it, you have to calculate your emissions. You have to pay over that. And that's how we create a level playing field. That is the story from the EU. Of course, if you are maybe from China or India, you could see that a little bit different.
Might be. But these things are complicated. You had a few slides you wanted to show us, to walk us through this.
So what is first important to mention is that CBAM is currently focused very much on the EU. The EU, European Union, is the first one to install a mechanism like CBAM. However, next year, from 2027, also the UK will have a CBAM mechanism. And we see currently countries like Norway, like Turkey, Vietnam, many other countries gearing up to also create a CBAM mechanism. And the reason is, one, it's sustainability, but maybe also that if you have your own system and you pay your emissions in your own country, via your own ETS system, then you do not have to pay them again in the EU. And for many countries, that is, of course, interesting. Apart from that, you can imagine that I was half a year ago in Serbia at an event, and I was talking to people. They were responsible for creating or not creating a CBAM mechanism over there. And I told them, like, you have to realize that if you do not install a CBAM mechanism, that countries like, for example, Turkey or Bosnia or many countries around you will start to dump their products into your market, because for them it's harder to enter the EU market because there is now suddenly a tax on carbon, and there are still many factories that are not decarbonized. And that makes that you get a lot of competition if you're a non-CBAM country, as well as your own factories have a hard time exporting to the EU because they are also faced with a carbon tax. And that means that it's getting, let's say, crowded on your own market. And I can imagine that's another reason why a lot of countries are now looking into also having their own CBAM mechanism. And how it's going to look like is following from the 1st of January, you have to pay over the products that you're importing. CBAM is very customs driven. So in our platform, we're working literally with customs data. We enter that in our platform, and based on every import line you have to connect the process of the factory in the third country to it to be able to calculate your emission. There are two kind of options. There's one, the default values. That means if you do not know what the emissions are of your factory, and there are actual values, and that means that you do know and that you have like this verified. Between the 1st of January and the 31st of December, you have to calculate these emissions, and on the 1st of February 2027, you can start buying certificates all the way up to 30 September 2027. And by then, you want to have as much actual data as possible, because actual data is in most cases much lower than default data, and that means that you have to pay less money.
So you basically needed to collect your data already from January on to prove that you have a certain carbon footprint and not fall back onto the standard values, or is it that you can have just 1 month of data?
No, you need to have 12 months, and that means that if you have a supplier, and it's now April, maybe when you're listening to this podcast, and you ask your factory, do you guys have a monitoring plan? Then most likely you're going to end up with default values. We will make a few calculations in a little bit. But for example, I was talking last week with a company, they're active in the fastener industry. And for them, the difference is, do I add 70 euros per every ton that I'm importing? And the average price per ton over there was like 900 euros. Or do I add 700 euros if I have to go for default values?
Ouch. Oh.
So it's massive.
Oh, yeah. Doubling the price, that's heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the problem is that many of these companies do not know yet if they can calculate actual or default values, because it depends on their factories if they get verified data. Now, the issue is that currently they're selling their products, currently they're importing it and selling it, but only by the end of the year they will know if their factory really managed to get verified data. And there are many reasons to assume that they will not. For example, that companies will not receive actual data because, first of all, there are, for example, not enough verifiers. But another problem is that if you have a certain supply chain, all the way from the company that does the last, let's say, process, to the steel mill or to the aluminium producer, if you do not have the data from those factories in between, you can't use any of the data which is below. So, for example, from the aluminium or the steel producer. And that's usually where most of the emissions are. So you end up with maybe having a 5 or 10% actual values, and then 90% of your supply chain is default values. And again, you don't want to go to these 4, 5, 6, 700 euro surcharge. And that's CBAM these days, guys.
That's CBAM for you, massive. Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
That must be a shock for many purchasing departments. But when you say verified data, is it like with a quality management audit that they have an auditing company coming in, looking at your process as your data, and then verifying it with a stamp and a piece of paper, or how do you get verified data?
That's a lot of steps, which is, I could talk for hours about that, but basically it means that you have a monitoring plan, that you track everything in your company. You have to measure it. There are standards for that. Usually you need a consultant who helps you on the spot, explaining how to do that. You need to understand your processes. If you have to go for a bubble approach, meaning that you can combine processes together, or if you have to do several standalone processes. And eventually all that data you need to report to the verifier. The verifier verifies if you've done everything correctly. The verifier has to be appointed by the EU. So, for example, an SGS, TÜV, Bureau Veritas, LQA, these companies will most likely become verifiers. They are appointed in the EU, and then they will offer these services in, let's say, China or in India. And they will have to go to your factory and eventually give you an approval. And only from that moment, your importers can use the data as actual data. And the tricky part is that the price of the cost you have to pay for the certificates will only be known in 2027. They will take quarterly averages, and based on that, they will determine the price in 2027. The problem is that a lot of importers are importing now.
Yeah. But that price, I'm a slow thinker. So at least for me, I know that the audience is much smarter than I am. When you talk about the price, are you talking about what people say is the carbon dioxide tax? The 0.1 euro per kilogram, or what are you referring to when it comes to the price?
So for example, you can see here a simplified CBAM calculation, which is the embedded emissions. That means the emissions you get from a factory. And you can deduct from that a benchmark. A benchmark is an average of the 10% cleanest producing installations in the EU times a CBAM factor. And the CBAM factor is a factor which was last year 100%, this year 97.5%, and it will go all the way down to 0. Meaning, and it's a little bit hard if you're only listening to this, if we would put this in numbers, we would have an embedded emission of 2.5, and we can deduct from that a CBAM benchmark of 1.5 and multiply that times the CBAM factor. Well, in case that's 100%, it's 2.5 minus 1.5 is 1. But in case the CBAM factor is 0, it's actually 2.5 minus 0. So every year, the CBAM benchmark will have a smaller effect. Yeah, CBAM benchmark is almost seen as a discount, or because you can deduct it from the emission factor. That amount, in this case, 2.5 minus 1.5, you have to multiply times the price of a CBAM certificate. And that CBAM certificate is connected to the ETS price. This is, for example, the price of the fluctuation of last year. As you can see, it was on 65 euros. It went all the way up close to 100. And now at the moment, it's back to 70. But if I look at a much broader horizon, in 2008, it was close to a few euros. In 2022, it was close to 50 euros. So this is not a stable price. And for the first year, this price is only determined in 2027. And from there on, you have to buy your CBAM certificates every quarter. The problem is, or not a problem, but the situation is that the CBAM factor goes down. That means that you can deduct less and less of the benchmarks. And those that are able to view my sheets see that in the first calculation, with a CBAM factor of 97.5, we're paying 88 euros per megaton. Once the CBAM factor is down to 0%, we would pay 212 euros per megaton. If we would take a price of 250 euros per EUA, which is like an average of the 10 largest banks that made an estimation where they think this ETS price is going to, would be 250 euros instead of 80, we would pay a price of 625 euros. And if we would take an emission factor not of 2.5 but of 4, we would even end up at the price of 1,000 euros per megaton. And I even see default values of 8. So it's super important that people understand what's happening at the moment and that they are acting on this. Also in pricing their products.
That is massive, especially with 4 tons of CO2 per metric ton, for example, for aluminium. That's what you get for the best primary alloys that are out there. If you're looking on a global average, you're looking more something like 16 tons per ton of aluminium on the alloy side. And that would be then like 4,000 euros per ton of castings or aluminium on top of that. So that is a massive impact on the cost basis.
Yes, but electricity is excluded. So most often a big part of that number is electricity. So that's not part of the calculation.
No, I don't understand. If I make a primer in China, I use coal-based electricity, I start with an ore and I produce 1 kilogram of alloy, then the electricity must be included, right?
Yeah, so you have like direct emissions and indirect emissions on the CBAM. And for steel, aluminium, iron, direct emissions are included. Indirect emissions you only have to report. If you talk about fertilizers, cement and hydrogen, then you do have to pay for electricity. That's just how it is at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would mean that the coal power plant has to be reported because it's directly correlated to the production of the aluminium. When you're thinking about the primary electrolysis, because that takes a lot of energy.
Yeah, so you have to look at the material, right? And how much CO2 it emits in the air. Yeah. And then the electricity you use, that is currently still excluded. But maybe in 5-6 years, that's different. Because initially it would all be included. But then they changed that, I think, at the end of 2025.
Interesting.
It's impactful. But I have to say that we see a big difference. Some companies are completely prepared. They understand what they are doing. And there are also companies that are importing and they do not understand that in 2027 there will be quite a bill to be paid. The practical issue is that because some companies are not yet aware, they are not including the surcharge in their price. And that makes it hard for those that are aware to increase their prices. Because if you want to compete and the more generic your product, the harder it is, let's say screws, for example, then if you suddenly faced with default values because your supplier somehow didn't manage to get proper verified data, then that has simply a financial impact, And it's important to realize that.
That's a massive impact, especially when you're talking about an industry that was fighting over cents per 5-10 kilos of casting. And that's for decades and pushing down the price of just a few cents cheaper than other suppliers. So we switched the suppliers in a heartbeat. And now you're coming in with a 20, 30, 50% upcharge. That is massive if you don't have done your homework. But I think it's a good time to dig into what it actually means and look at some real data for aluminium, for example, imported from China to see what comes out of it.
Okay. I can do that. We have a platform where we actually streamline CBAM because you can imagine if you have quite some suppliers and you have a lot of imports, you actually want to be able to match the data, make sure that your imports are connected with the right processes of the right factories. That's what we do, and we can turn it into one single document, which you can upload to the EU portal, and then in one time you can report all that data. You can also forecast, and you can also provide an audit trail. These are simply basics which you need if you're importing a lot of CBAM goods. I mean, if you're having 1 or 2 suppliers, you'll be fine. But when you have multiple, it gets a little bit tricky. And this is, for example, a code you guys gave me, right? 72026000. Is that a good one? So
casted aluminum components.
Yeah, you can see that in the platform, there's quite a difference between India and China. And this is default values, meaning if you do not have the actual values, you will be pushed back to default values. And these are the default values currently in place. These are the benchmarks. This benchmark every year will be lower because you can multiply it times a smaller CBAM factor, as explained in the previous sheet. And that means that the price goes up every year, also assuming that the price for ETS will go slightly up every year. And then, for example, in India, you pay in 2026 an average of 134 euros. Well, in China, you have to add around 400 euros per ton extra.
That is massive.
Yeah, that's heavy.
I mean, if you look at the casting, now many purchasers and sales guys are going to be angry with me, but I've done a fair amount of quotes, on casting components. And if you take the material and the casting itself, coming out of the casting machine, just take away the ingate, as we say, you have a raw casting. No machining, no surface treatment, nothing. Then, according to me, 50% is material and 50% is casting and casting operation and paying for the bills, right? And normally you pay like €3.50 per kilogram of aluminum. If you add 0.5 euros per kilogram on top of it, you have wiped out the total profit of that company. There's no way.
Yeah. What should I say, Staffan?
Yeah, here comes a question for you. If I flip this coin and say like this, I'm supplying a track manufacturer in Europe. I have a facility in Czech or Poland or, good guys, good casters. But they are what we say first source, and there's always a second source. That second source is from China, for example. All of a sudden, you enter the autumn when everybody wants to do the yearly price negotiation for the next year to come. And you walk in like you always do every year the last 20 years of your career. You have scrutinized everything and you can lower the price with 3.92% or something. And you're just expecting the fight. But now you have to think that the second source from China has all of a sudden a penalty on 0.35 euros per kilogram of your part. And your part is 6 kilos, so this is actually massive. It's almost 2 euros. And in casting, this is a lot of money. So if you flip the coin, if you have a nice foundry operation in Europe, you actually have to take care so you don't sell yourself too cheap next autumn in a yearly negotiation, because your competitors from Asia will start to have a penalty.
Yeah, let's take into account that, of course, the ETS system is also starting to count in the EU. So also here, companies have to start to pay more and more. But the European installations are usually more decarbonized than what we see in many other countries. So that is the kind of advantage the system gives to those industries that are decarbonized. The problem is, of course, that there are many countries where they're completely aware that moving from blast furnace to electric arc furnace, it takes you 6-7 years, for example, if we talk about steel production. And this is not done overnight, also in aluminium. So, a lot of people could see CBAM coming because the plans were there already for many, many years. Problem is that up till actually 3 months ago, a big part of the market still thought that CBAM would eventually evaporate. And that didn't happen.
Disappear.
And now a lot of companies are facing the reality. But you're right. If you are in the EU and you have clean production, CBAM is giving you most likely a competitive edge. However, if you're producing in green zones in China, for example, and you can prove that by verification, you also have a massive advantage compared to those installations that are not so clean.
But then you have to have the verified data, isn't it? That you can prove that you have the carbon footprint.
But those companies, they are quite prepared.
Yeah. I can imagine it's usually the topic that we're seeing, that we have a regulation happening in Europe and everybody else is way more prepared than the companies within the continent.
Wow. Yeah. That's also why it's allowed by the WTO, right? Because if you decarbonize in your own country, you can have the same advantage as the companies in the EU. And that's why they call it level playing field. Other companies are calling it like a trade barrier or something like that. But it is actually like that. If you have clean production, the CBAM is not really a big issue for you.
No.
So, Staffan, I think that could be a very big advantage for especially sustainable Indian foundries. Now, with the free trade agreement between India and the EU, their low carbon footprint from their production, that could be a massive business development opportunity for them, taking up a lot of work that comes from China that would have then again that 300, 400, 500 euro per ton penalty on top of them.
Absolutely. And one should remember, I mean, if you look at the casting component, 90% of the carbon dioxide emission comes from the alloy. The casting machine itself is quite simple. I mean, you have a melting operation, which is 0.3 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of alloy, but the big thing comes from the production of the alloy itself. And the problem in the aluminum industry is that 50% of all aluminum we're using is primary. It has to be from ore, basically, because, aluminum as a design alloy or design material is growing that fast, especially with EVs and telecom equipment. So you have to feed the beast. And I can imagine that, you have a good chance if you have bad competition from Asia. But what if you have one of the big dragons? Because they have definitely done the homework. They are in a green zone. They have done this, I guess. I just presume they have, that they're ready to show the certificates and everything for their importer in Europe.
Yeah, yes and no, because I think actually the first year it will be a lot default values. And if you see, for example, the default values from Indonesia on certain CN codes, they're very high. 8. That is very, very high. And CBAM is like it's really at the start. I think in 10 years, we will not maybe even remember how difficult the first few years were. But there's still a lot of loopholes and a lot of things that need to be fixed. For example, one is the aluminium pre-consumer scrap loophole. You could cheat with that. So there's now a proposal that scrap is becoming a standalone product category. At the same time, what's also difficult for companies is that they maybe can't find a verifier. All the big companies probably pay to get for sure their verifier, but there are 10,000s of factories that need to be verified. And there are a lot of these kind of hurdles why I actually think that most of the companies will eventually report default values in the first year.
I think you're right. If you look at our industry, it consists of 80% family-owned businesses that are small. The big dragons I'm referring to, there are like 10 of them. So if you look at the foundry industry, most guys are 8 die casting machines, 100 people employed. That's 70% of our industry, and for them to take on this challenge, no, I agree with you. I think they will run default values first year or two, or maybe the first 2-3 years. Yeah. The only thing that happens, they have to make less money.
Well, yeah, or what we also see is the supply chains are shifting. They shift to countries where you have like lower default values, and the more complex the product, the less that happens. But for example, in the fastener industry, a screw, there are a lot of fasteners that are just very generic, and that has quite an impact actually.
Yeah, an M4 is an M4. It's just a length.
Yeah. Not everybody in the fastener industry probably agrees with that, but for me, also an M4 is just an M4.
But for the average person going into a builder shop and just picking the M4 that he needs and that are the cheapest, he doesn't care where they are made of. It's just for them have the cheapest one to have the lowest cost for the project, and then go home. Start building.
But also a lot of small advantages to gain if you understand CBAM well, because it makes a massive difference now if you import on the 31st of December or the 1st of January, for a simple reason that your CBAM factor goes lower, meaning that you can use your benchmark much less to deduct subtracted from your emission. You need to having verified or not verified data is going to be extremely important. And if you have all these ducks in a row, you can lower your risks. Another thing is there are options how to hedge your CBAM certificate price, which is literally going up and down all the time. So if you understand CBAM well, and a lot of large companies do that, they have like experts in-house, they are well prepared. Yeah, but I remember in the casting industry, not everybody. And that's sometimes shocking to me. We talk with multinationals who literally ask in the first meeting, what is CBAM? I'm like, wow, if you don't register yourself today, then at the 31st of March, your containers are stuck at the border, because you should have registered last year. Many companies didn't. We just heard, for example, from the National Competition Authority in Belgium that 50% of the companies they expected to register are registered. That means 50% haven't done that. In the EU, they postponed the deadline from the 1st of January to the 31st of March. And they said, well, if you can prove that you're in the process, then your containers can still continue. But from the 31st of March, you will have to put there a Y code. And if you can't prove that you are in that process, then it stops. And
that is last March of this year.
Yeah, that's in, what is it?
Basically
in a few weeks.
From the time of recording, 4 weeks away.
Yeah. I'm just
this morning I got a call
here.
like, hey Marcel, my container is stuck. Can you guys help me? So yeah, we can literally get you up to speed in a day. But it's not a day. On the other hand, like these are startup problems. Starting, it's probably happening all the first year, and then in the upcoming years, companies know how to deal with it. It becomes a process. And
yeah, but then you also expect that CBAM will develop, right? I mean, I heard one loophole was assembly. So if you put a couple of nuts and fasteners and maybe a phony cable, all of a sudden you can find a loophole saying, yeah, it's an assembly, it's not a casting, it's not the same code. But I understand that this is probably going to change already in 2028. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're very up to date. In 2028, many new categories will be added. Chemicals, but also whole washing machines and fences and everything. Most of the things you have in your kitchen will be all part of CBAM. And this is actually, let's say, a chain reaction, which I believe is hard to stop because first it's, let's say, iron or aluminium part, right? So what do companies do? They're like, you know what, let's produce that part in China and then import it because it's not part of CBAM. Now machine parts will be included. So what does the company says that is producing textile? They're like, hey, but my products are more expensive because all the machines I buy, they come from China and they have a CBAM surcharge. So it would be fair if all my textile products would also be part of CBAM. And that is how these, let's say, organizations that are part of a lobby group, they start to lobby for this. And I guess it will be step by step expanded.
Yeah. It's pretty big businesses, so they come with a lot of weight. I mean, both politically when it comes to employment and certain regions, and then also the mere turnover of those industries is big. I can understand that you kind of have an example now from steel, iron, aluminum, fertilizer, and now it expands because, I mean, it's like having small kids, you know. If my brother has a lollipop, then I should have one too. That's how it works.
Yeah, that's how
Simple
it will work.
Especially when we're just talking about aluminium steel, I think we also need to mention magnesium because what's the situation there?
Yeah, magnesium is not part of CBAM at the moment. No.
That's interesting.
So that's a big driver, especially now in the found industry. We see so much interest in magnesium coming up more and more. Most of it comes from China with a quite high carbon footprint, above 20 kilograms of CO2 per kilo of magnesium. And now it's not subjected to CBAM. Is that an unfair advantage, or is there plans also to include magnesium? Do you know anything about that?
Actually, that I don't know. I looked up the code, and magnesium is not part of CBAM, but it's not that I have heard too much discussion about it. I would have to look that up, to be honest, or ask my colleague who usually dives much deeper in these topics. Yeah.
But we always ask people in this podcast if to give an advice to a younger person to have a nice, interesting work with a good salary in die casting. I kind of guess that being CBAM expert is your choice. And what I'm trying to say is that I'm kind of guessing that the big organizations are vacuum cleaning the employers market now for people that actually know something. They could build these chains, get all the ducks in a row, get the actual data to say the CBAM tax. I mean, it's a big field. I mean, how many people could it be that are experts in melting aluminum?
Yeah, not too much. And that's also an issue on the verifier side, right? Find all those people that are expert in CBAM and aluminium. As you know, I'm president of the International Association and I get emails from all around the world. And sometimes I get emails from verifiers that I'm like, I'm a generalist. I run a company. It's my employees who are specialists because CBAM is about steel production, iron production, cement production, fertilizer production, hydrogen, electricity. Then in every country is different. You have CBAM UK, you have CBAM EU. It's about sustainability. Customs is very important in CBAM. It's impossible to know everything. But on the verifier side, you also need to understand a lot. And I sometimes get questions that are like, do they actually 100% know what they are doing? And that's very tricky. And if I would answer your question about if you would start now in that business, what would be my advice? Please note that if you start a company and you want to import CBAM-related goods, that if your company is less than 2 years old and you want to become CBAM authorized, that you have to hand in your forecast. So how much are you going to import for the upcoming 2 years? And based on that, they make a risk assessment. And if you're less than 2 years old, you're in the maximum risk, in the highest risk category. And that means that you have to pay a deposit. And we had last week a company, they did 5,000 tons and they had to pay a deposit of 987,000 euros upfront within 30 days.
Excuse me?
Which was impossible for them. So you have to make sure that you can handle this financial hit.
Take that again. I start a company, I design something, I'm holding up some mechanical thing here from my messy, like something like this. And you say to the EU, I'm a new started company. The EU says, yeah, then you're a big risk. Please hand in your forecast. You make a forecast of something, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 tons of aluminum parts from, let's say, China. And then the EU tells you to pay 900,000 euros as a deposit for the CBAM because they don't know if you will survive as a company. Is that the way I should understand it?
Yeah, so in that case, if you want to do that, you might want to import your first years via another company. This is not easy. Yeah, I think a lot of companies who are starting now, they don't realize that.
So there's a market for guys that are smart that could set up a company that keeps some certain supply chains and then sell CBAM perfect goods into Europe, or?
Yeah. No, yeah, that's
Hey,
true. I mean,
hold my beer. I'm starting a new company.
Yeah. They want to make sure that you pay the bills, and these companies, they are high risk, but indeed in practice, this company was lucky because they had an amazing cooperation with their supplier. So their supplier said, look, we're going to help you out, we will pay that for you, because they would not have any access to the EU market if they wouldn't work with this company. But in most cases, this is just too much money.
Yeah.
That is massive, and then especially when you're having a whole automotive chain behind that, and where every margin is already sucked out of it, that you really are operating on as cost basis. And then suddenly a few millions on deposits coming through, or later on the 1st of January 2027, the bill comes, oh, you need to buy 10, 15, 25 million of certificates to really offset your carbon footprint imports.
Yeah.
That is something where the outcry will be there.
Yeah, you don't need that when you're a new started business.
Yeah.
No.
Let's put it that way.
Yesterday I was in a call with one of the top 10 car brands in the EU, and they do really inform their supply chain. They give even trainings, and they usually don't work with startups, right? So it's not for these companies. It's let's say quite doable. But yeah, they do make. I've also seen that was not a car company, but I've also seen another massive brand. They literally ask their suppliers, like, "Are you aware of CBAM? And what is the CBAM surcharge you're going to charge next year?" And I think that's actually just to test if that company is understanding what the effect of CBAM is, because somehow half a year ago, everybody in the market, you can literally Google it, like so many consultants were saying that CBAM only was a 2.5% tax. And we were like, that's not true. But at the time, Dubring didn't have 2,000 companies in its platform, and we were not as big as now. So we were literally trying to tell everybody, look guys, it is more 60%, because the 2.5% is only a discount you get on the CBAM factor. But CBAM was like a side hustle for many consultants. We do it every day, and they didn't pay attention. And then in that case, if it's only 2.5%, who cares?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, exactly. Yep. You don't hire a consultant for 200,000 euros to get the ducks in line or your shit in order. I mean, but don't you think this is so terrifying for very flat organizations? So they hear what they want to hear. It's like psychology, if something is really terrifying, you always find a small glimpse of light somewhere and say that, they will change this, otherwise they kill our industry, or it's only 2.5%, and they kind of just look for the answers they want to hear, because it's too terrifying.
Yeah. There were many reasons why companies are not prepared. One is, for example, some certain associations, of course, they lobbied against CBAM, and they communicated that it will go away anyway. To change that mindset into it's actually happening is very hard for them. But that actually made companies pull the brake and wait as long as possible. But at the moment, it's best to be as much prepared as possible. Second, I literally talk with purchasing managers. They say, yeah, CBAM, I know it's coming, but I go with pension in 2 years, and it's such a hard job. It's up to the next guy. And I can come up with another 10 things I've heard in the past. It's just not, it's nobody's favorite topic, except maybe Dubring, because we do it day and night.
I mean, I've been looking at this CBAM format that you're supposed to fill in. It's an Excel sheet from hell. It contains like 2,500 lines and rows and columns, and it gives me a migraine after 12 seconds. But your system, you kind of work your way, you put the ducks in a row, and you do your homework, and then this kind of generates all the things and the report I sent to the European Commission, right?
Yeah, that's actually what we do.
In a nutshell. Yeah.
And then next year, if you have your emissions paid in the UK, you can deduct it from the emissions you paid in the EU. And if you have like one supplier and you import every quarter 1 or 2 imports, you can do it manually. But once you have multiple suppliers with multiple processes and you have many import lines, you're importing several containers with different CN codes, it becomes a mess, and you want to automate that. And if, let's say, Petra is today managing CBAM, and this is, by the way, another massive risk. A lot of companies have only one CBAM expert, and if that person leaves, there's a massive gap. So let's say Petra leaves, and then Marcel takes over, and Marcel leaves after 2 years, and then let's say Charles takes over, and Charles needs to figure out what Petra did 3 years ago by looking into those 50 or 100 communication templates which has been sent every time there was a decarbonization somewhere in the supply chain of the factory. That's very messy, and then you will not be charged actual values but default values, and those costs we calculated can be very high. And that's why companies are like, okay, from 1,990 euros a year, we have a massive calculator that automates this for us. And that's when you get 2,000 companies in your platform.
Yeah, but I mean, why should it be a risk that someone is trying to hire your expert when there's a lack of the people and the cost is increasing every year? I mean, come on now. They will have the best salary development in the whole die casting industry the next 10 years. I mean, let's face it. They are the new unicorns for us.
Sorry, who?
The guy who runs the CBAM successful in a company.
Oh yeah, they can say.
I mean, they are unicorns in die casting. Believe me, I know my industry better than. That's the only thing in this podcast that I know better than you, Marcel, is how my industry is working. I'm not so sure about that, but anyway, anyhow, these guys will be unicorns. They will start their own firms and tell their employers that, you know what, you can hire me back for 200 euros an hour.
Yeah,
because otherwise I cross the street to the competition and I do the same job there, because they will be sitting in a restaurant. Okay, what is the bidding?
Well,
it's like you're too young to, and also Fabian, but I was around at the year 2000, and the software guys told us that maybe everything will crash, the bank systems, because all the old software is from the 80s. And I know guys that charge back then, is 24 years now, 25, 26, they were around 300 euros per hour. They beaten the tax lawyers in hourly rate. I'm not saying that the CBAM experts will go to 300 euros an hour, but I mean, in our business, a consultant has what, 80?
Yeah.
80. Yeah. And it's an experienced guy.
Yeah, but maybe they will go even above, as you mentioned, Marcel. There's a massive lack of people knowing what to do. And if you want to have it today to get to not default values, to get to actual values, which makes a 10x increase in cost, you don't care what you pay that guy. If you pay them 3,000 euro for a week, that's still cheaper than paying default values.
I mean, look at a truck manufacturer, for example. I mean, the amount of aluminum in a truck, what is it? 1 ton, at least. That comes only from China. Then you have another ton from Malaysia and Sweden and whatever region. But this is going to be a headache.
I actually think that where the money is where the verifiers are, because they're actually the ones that are going to be scarce. And that's, for example, also why a lot of companies work with a platform like us, because CBAM is changing all the time. If you would look back in the past year, we had a webinar every month with an update, and not just a small update. Like just before Christmas, I think it was around 1,800 pages of legislation were released. And in the months before, every time some part of that was leaked. And they, for example, the default values suddenly changed, for example. Or you find out that, let's say, that default value of a product which is up in the supply chain is higher than the finished product, right? That's not possible. The steel where you make a screw from. So there was a lot to discuss and a lot of information to share. And even now, there are going to be changes in the current CBAM mechanism we have. To keep up to date with that and to track that, it's a full-time job. And that's why it's better to outsource that to, for example, software, because it saves you a lot of time and I think also risks.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking about, as you said earlier in the pod, that if you change people, for example, keeping track of the history, and if you have got 1,800 pages of legislation, then it starts to be, a full-time job. And if you look at even the purchasing organizations in Europe, they're pretty thin when it comes to people working with things like this. They will think like a lawyer there. And the thing is, what I'm meeting, because our process happens to be a good thing for CBAM because of very low carbon dioxide and blah, 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 by technology. And then people tell me, yeah, that's good with the sustainability, but that's another department. So what I'm saying is that, and who is choosing the alloy and all these factors that are driving the carbon dioxide and the CBAM cost? Well, it's the designer, because he has a design challenge. He's going to make this, again, part, He chooses the alloy, the process, everything. And that is 100% defining your CBAM cost, basically. And when a guy like that says, yeah, but that's another department. All right, then there's an education problem among designers in Europe as well.
Yeah. Well, Stefan, in between 2024 and 2025, in those years, I think I did myself, in the startup, we were at the time over 1,000 demos. And our conversion was quite low. I mean, why? Because everybody was like, CBAM next year. Now I literally get replies from, and then I see, hey, I was talking to that person somewhere in 2024, August, and suddenly they come back like, I need you for CBAM. But the sales process we always had was like, we called sustainability. They forwarded us to procurement. Procurement actually forwarded us to the legal department. And the legal department forwarded us to the customs department. And even you could sometimes speak with 4 or 5 departments before someone eventually wanted to take a demo with you. And the only one who was actually really shocked by the information was eventually the CFO, because they go like, whoa, I have to look a few years up front, and if my cost increase with 50%, then I actually need to change my pricing on it. So that was very hard to it's so many departments.
I can imagine
involved.
that is crazy, especially you've seen it that so many times it's just divided on certain tasks, certain departments, and they have no interest in talking to each other. They've never even met each other, and I think that is also the biggest challenge to really get to sustainable products, and then as a consequence also to an effective CBAM pricing.
Yeah, but let's simplify it. If you have CBAM under control, you have your imports from your customs service provider, sometimes maybe a few, because you could work with several in your country, sometimes maybe even from different countries, but let's say you have all that data. You throw it in the platform. On the other side, you have your suppliers. They provide actual verified data or default values. That you link with each other. You get one document, you upload it, you pay your cost. That's also how simple CBAM is once you have it under control.
Yeah, that's everything in life. From slalom, marriage, family, CBAM.
Yeah, but Staffan, how do you actually see the change in the EU? Do you think a lot of companies will insource with respect to casting in the EU, or is that not an option?
What I see, I work Comtech Rio casting. We have a semi-solid process, and to drive this, we develop certain alloys that are highly functional, but they are based on scrap, and they have extremely low carbon dioxide emissions compared to the alternative. The alternative is a primary, which is 4.2 to 20 kilograms of carbon dioxide. And what I understand from listening to you, and this understands the interest of these alloys, is that if you use these and have the certificate from the alloy producer saying that you're below 0.9, your CBAM is 0.
If your benchmark is higher than what you're importing, then you go to 0 indeed. Yeah. You can't go minus, that's not allowed, but yeah.
I know, that's a pity, but maybe that will come. So I mean, this is what I see. I see it's called Rio Cool, and I see the number of projects in 1 year has gone from like 3 to 20. Okay. And I think this is pretty much about CBAM. Some of them are just technical driven, but this is a CBAM thing. But I don't see people changing the supply from Asia to Europe yet, but I think they will balance between source 1 and source 2 and source 3.
And casting is also very contract related, right? And you can't just find easy someone who can do exactly the same with the same quality.
No, you cannot.
There's a lot of verification going on before everything starts, and changing suppliers is always a hassle because you have to build up a pile that you can feed your continuously running car production line, and then still change the tool over to a new foundry that you have to adjust it, that it fits their machinery and then get started. That's usually a run against the clock, so that's quite complicated. But as Staffan said, when you already have 2-3 suppliers already, which is quite common, that you shift the volumes from the now expensive CBAM cost supplier in Far East to more European supplier.
Yeah, but I would like to comment on that, because if you look at Chinese foundry groups that have started operations or are starting operations in Europe, number has never been this high. And the big guys from China, they are starting in Hungary, Czechia, pretty much Eastern Europe, I would say. That they are either buying something and putting the logo on top. And I think one reason is actually CBAM, because these are smart guys. They're pretty big companies that really looks out for changes in regulation and the governmental demands.
Yeah.
So that is another effect I see.
That's an interesting you say that, because a lot of companies working on indirect representation. Do you know what? Sorry, not a lot, but some do. So you have direct representation. That means that you are responsible for your, let's say, what's the word, for the taxes and for the cost you have to pay to the government over here. And you have indirect representation, that you appoint someone and that company takes the risks for you. And we, for example, see steel traders with 500,000 tons. Then you know, if you are representing that company, and it's going to be or 70 or 700 euros. 700 is a lot for them, but let's say 80 or 400 euros. Then we're talking about many millions. And if you are that fiscal representative, you think twice if you want to do that for a steel trader, because let's say they leave next year once the cost has to be paid, then you are effed. Now, the thing is that those steel traders, they are not going to say, like, look, I'm not going to pay you 100 millions up front because that's horrible for my liquidity. And what they are doing is that they are they're actually starting their own companies now in the EU. It's one of the services we do. We do the advisory part on that. So we work with companies in the EU states to help with that. But you see the shift of these Chinese, Indian, especially Indian companies that are like, okay, let's then start a company in the EU, because if it's me over there and I'm the supplier, the risks are completely different. That if there's like a third party that is representing me, they're much more scared if I'm going to pay than, of course, I am myself.
Exactly.
And that's changing.
Interesting development. Yeah, with just beginnings, we saw Chinese automakers setting up their plants in Eastern Europe, and okay, at the beginning we just thought, okay, they're just following their customers. But now with the CBAM, the more we understand it, the more it becomes more of a strategy to not only follow their customers, but also to follow their supplier chain and avoid certain tax strategies.
Yeah. It's not that you avoid CBAM because you still have to pay it the same amount. It's just that someone else doesn't have to take the risk, and that also costs money.
Yeah. No, I mean that you can change. You were producing it in China for the European market, and then you have a facility also that is in Europe. Then you take the tool, ship the tool to Europe, and then produce it within the EU.
Yeah.
That you don't have an import into the EU anymore.
Yeah. But it's something you have to do good, because you need to install a director. You need to make sure you have enough substance. You will probably have to start paying taxes, and then you get into transfer pricing. Like, where do I drop the profit? Is it in China? Is it in the Netherlands? Then the country where you start your company has an opinion about that. So it's not that easy, actually.
No, and it's a moving target, as we hunters say. CBAM. I mean, it will change. It will be assemblies. More and more codes. You never know. Next free trade agreement, blah blah blah, thing in 5-10 years. How this will play out, because we all are sitting so far from that table to understand it. I guess I'm thinking. I mean, the Prime Minister of Sweden is not calling me for advice many times a week.
Me
Must
neither.
admit, he has never had, actually. And, yeah.
No, but we'll see. Nobody has a glass ball, right? We can't see what the future brings.
No.
But even though there's a lot of pressure from all sides, you do see a lot of developments in many countries on the because if eventually, I think it's a trend that we want to produce cleaner around the world. That eventually everybody wants that, right? So I think on the long term, this is actually also a trend we should take into account, and that's maybe also what we want to give to the next generation. I don't want to sound like a complete tree hugger, but I think that is really important for everybody.
Yeah, especially with that CBAM cost, your want now has a real monetary value. If you don't pay it, you have something that's okay to give you the last push over the edge to really go for that direction, to go for a Rio casting component made of 100% post-consumer scrap alloy instead of the primary from Far East. Now you have really an argument in your hand to do that.
And it makes sense, right? Let's say you import only for 10 euros, but it actually costs the earth 20 euros of equal pollution you throw in the air. That's not sustainable on the long term.
No, it's not. It's not. And I come from the country Greta, but screw that. But I'm a hunter, so I would like to have my wood, with the animals, so I can shoot something. So It's pretty important for all of us. But I would, to circle back to what Fabian was into, it's the first time we have a money tied to the problem, basically. I mean, before it has been legislations how you can pollute things and do things, and the only thing they can do is drag you to court once in a while. But the courts, at least in Sweden, has not been that successful in actually putting people in jail for doing massively wrongly by purpose. Now this is something else. This is a broader way to actually do something and put a price tag on sustainability. So on top level, I'm pretty pro, actually.
No, it's revolutionary. I mean, and it takes real leadership to push this, especially in times that a lot of people are pushing against. Now, I talk with a lot of importers, right? They are coming to us and they want to solve their CBAM issue. And they are especially not happy with how the mechanism functions and how that it's so hard for them to implement. But they are all pro producing cleaner, and they actually are also understanding that, you know, if we have a union and we have certain rules for our domestic producers, then it would be quite fair that if you are in another country, that you at least have to create a level playing field for that. I also understand that if you're in a country where it's much more poverty and, you know, the only thing what you can get around the corner is coal, and you don't know barely what is emission, that for you it's very hard to understand why the hell in the EU they are caring about emissions. Well, all you care about is to make a little bit of profit. So, you know, it's...
Yeah, but you have to start somewhere. So basically, as we are a developed country, we want to do that. Now we also have to do something in that direction, I think. With the CBAM, we have a target, and that helps us to get more sustainable, because it's not just having a green slide and we're doing something good. It's not like a charity anymore. Now it's a hardcore business strategy to get sustainable, because it costs you money or it doesn't cost you money if you do it right.
No, we you know, the EU once chose this path, and now we have like a cleaner and cleaner industrial factories. If you would stop now, I think you end up with rather clean factories, but nobody around the world cares, because eventually money is eventually what's most important. I've been owner of an lingerie brand. I was producing adhesive bras, and I was inventing them and making patents and selling them all around the world. And I was using 3M tape, like exclusive, great tape. And I knew that my competitors, some of them were using tape. Can't say too much about it, but let's say it was really bad to have that on your skin. And I had multiple meetings with very large chains in the EU. And then I spoke with that purchaser, and the purchaser said, "Yeah, Mars, you know, I can see this is bad, this is good. But eventually your product is 40 cents more expensive, and I just need to reach my target. Next year I will have another job. So if you can't go down in price, I will still go for the other one." Eventually it's all about money. And what you mentioned now, sustainability is connected to money.
Yeah. In the end there, because money is the only KPI that people understands. Really, truly. I mean, how do you understand 98 or 96% delivery precision? In normal life, it is what it is. But money, everybody has a salary. Everybody wants to buy a sailing boat all the time.
Yeah, also the consequences of not being sustainable is something you experience in 20, 30 years. Maybe also in a totally different region of the world, it doesn't really impact you. But today, when you have to pay in 1 year a massive tax bill because you're not sustainable, that is something you experience right away. And as Staffan said, we all want that sailboat.
Yeah.
It's like kids, right? When I go to work, and I work crazy a lot of hours these days, because CBAM let's say it's a bit busy. When I leave home and I see my kids, I'm like, it's fine. But at the same time, you know, in the future, in 20 years, you wish you had 10 minutes with them when they were 6 and 8. And that is the same if we look into the environment, right? We can make a mess out of it, but in a few years, you wish you would still have the nice environment you had back in the days.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful sentence, and I think as a first step, I think with this podcast, we could give a quite good information piece to the foundry industry to get started to look into CBAM, and I think we definitely need to follow up somewhere in 2027 or 2028 to see what has changed, how are things progressing, because I think we could talk for another more 1, 2, 3, 4 hours on that.
Probably.
Let's do that. And by the way, on the previous topic, that's with everything. Also with pollution. You know, in the world we're all divided, but nobody wants pollution. Everybody wants it less. So that's with many topics. But I'm happy to meet you guys again in 2027. It was a lot of fun. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be able to speak so openly about this subject.
You're welcome. And for you, dear listener, that wants to understand more, I mean, pick up the phone, call Marcel at Dubrink. That's the best.
Thank you very much.
That's the best tip I can give you right now if you want to dig into this, because.
And I have a second tip for you. Don't forget to subscribe so that we see us in the next podcast episode. Thank you for joining in.
And thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Marcel. And then we see us in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.